The first $10,000 does not make you wealthy. It makes you difficult to scare. And in personal finance, that is often the first real form of power. People talk about money as if the important thresholds begin at six figures. $1 million, some glamorous number big enough to impress strangers and reassure your relatives. I understand why big numbers are cinematic. They look like milestones. They photograph well. But real financial turning points are usually much quieter than that. They do not announce themselves with applause. They announce themselves when your mind stops treating every small inconvenience like the opening scene of a disaster movie. That is why I care so much about the first $10,000. Not because it turns you into a rich person, because it is often the first amount of money large enough to change the chemistry of how you move through ordinary life. Before that point, most people are not really making financial decisions. They are making survival decisions dressed up as financial decisions. That distinction matters. When you have no real buffer, every choice carries too much weight. The check engine light comes on and your body reacts like you have been handed a medical diagnosis. A minor medical bill arrives and you start mentally rearranging the month. A friend invites you out and you do arithmetic before you answer. Your employer annoys you. Your city starts suffocating you. A better opportunity appears somewhere else. And all of it gets filtered through the same hard question: can I survive the downside if this goes wrong? When the answer is no. Life becomes narrow. That is what poverty really does to people. It does not just reduce comfort, it reduces option space. It shrinks the room in which a person can think, negotiate, experiment, refuse, and recover. Most people call this being practical. It is more brutal than that. It is life lived under the rule of immediate consequence. Now that state is often invisible from the outside. The person still goes to work, still pays bills, still laughs at dinner sometimes, still posts a vacation photo when one rare good week arrives. But underneath, the operating system is fragile. Every decision is running through a hidden piece of software that asks, will this hurt me right away? And when your brain keeps asking that question often enough, it becomes difficult to think about almost anything larger. That is why the first $10,000 is so powerful. It is not the amount itself. It is what the amount interrupts. What it interrupts is panic. I have always thought the most underrated word in finance is room. Not returns, not leverage, not alpha room. Room to think, room to wait, room to say no, room to absorb a hit without instantly turning the hit into debt. Room to distinguish between inconvenience and danger. The first $10,000 for a very large number of people is the first time money stops being only a pass through substance and starts becoming room. That is the shift, and once that shift happens, the world starts behaving differently. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Most people imagine savings as a pile. I think of it as a change in posture. The person with no savings leans toward every problem because he has to. He leans toward the landlord, the employer, the bank, the repair shop, the deadline, the bad offer, the bad timing, the slightly humiliating compromise. He leans because life keeps pushing and he has no counterweight. The person with a real buffer stands differently, not arrogantly, just differently. The first person hears every knock as a threat. The second person hears some of them as noise that is worth more than people think. There is a reason financial stress is so corrosive. It never stays in the money lane. It leaks everywhere. It leaks into sleep. It leaks into relationships. It leaks into patience. It leaks into how you negotiate, how you drive, how you shop, how you respond to your children, how you show up at work, how quickly you panic, and how much nonsense you will tolerate because you cannot afford to refuse it. That is what is so extraordinary about a modest threshold like $10,000. It does not need to solve your whole life. It only needs to remove enough fear that you stop solving every problem as if it were fatal. That is the beginning of intelligent financial life. People who have never experienced this often misunderstand what savings is for. They think an emergency fund is mainly about emergencies. That is only half true. An emergency fund is really about decision quality. It exists so you do not have to use a terrible source of money to solve a temporary problem. It exists so a broken laptop does not become credit card debt. It exists so a delayed paycheck does not become a personal crisis. It exists so a bad week does not have the power to rewrite the next 2 years of your life. That is a much more important job than simply being there. And this is where the first $10,000 becomes a real psychological border. Below that line, most people still feel breakable above it. Many do not feel rich, but they begin to feel less breakable. That is a huge distinction. I know people romanticize bigger milestones. The first $100,000 matters. Yes, the first $1 million matters. Yes. but those thresholds do something different. They begin to change the pace at which money can multiply. The first $10,000 changes the pace at which your nervous system gets attacked by ordinary life. That is why it comes first in the hierarchy of importance for most people. It changes your relationship with risk. A person with zero savings looks at risk and sees threat. A person with $10,000 looks at some of the same situations and sees possibility. Not because he suddenly became reckless, because he can finally afford to imagine a mistake that does not end the month. This is one of the least understood benefits of modest wealth. It does not just protect you from bad outcomes. It makes better outcomes available because it softens the price of trying. A person with no reserves cannot easily change jobs, move cities, negotiate harder, take a useful course, start a small side business, or walk away from a miserable arrangement. Every one of those choices comes with downside. Without a buffer, the downside dominates the analysis. With a buffer, the upside gets invited into the room. This is why money often seems to attract more money. Not because the universe rewards the rich, because buffers create optionality. And optionality creates better decisions. That is a much more rational and much more useful explanation. The first $10,000 is also the first time a lot of people discover something uncomfortable about themselves. They were not bad with money because they lacked intelligence. They were bad with money because they lacked breathing room. This matters enormously because people carry far too much shame around their financial life. They assume every bad choice proves weakness of character. Sometimes it does. But often the real problem is that they were trying to think strategically while their circumstances kept demanding tactical behavior. They were trying to think about investing while the rent, the car, the groceries, and the random emergency kept forcing everything back into the present tense. The present tense is where long-term wealth goes to die. That is why I say the first meaningful savings threshold is less about capital and more about time horizon. It pushes your mind forward. You stop thinking only in 7-day intervals. You start thinking in seasons, years, and trajectories. That shift changes everything. Without it, every article about investing, retirement, compounding, and wealth building feels like rich people wallpaper. Nice to look at. Useless in a real emergency. But when you have a real buffer, those ideas stop feeling abstract. Retirement accounts stop looking like a luxury. Index funds stop looking like something only confident people use. Courses, certifications, relocation, and other forms of self-investment stop feeling like fantasies. They become options with real economics. This is one reason the first $10,000 often changes a career before it changes a portfolio. When people are financially exposed, they are obedient in ways they do not fully understand. They tolerate the wrong boss, the wrong role, the wrong city, the wrong pay, the wrong treatment, because continuity is too expensive to interrupt. The paycheck is not just income, it is oxygen. That makes people weak negotiators. It makes them timid. It makes them grateful for treatment they should reject. It makes them confuse stability with survival. A modest savings buffer begins to change that. Not because it makes a person fearless, because it lowers the penalty for dignity. That is a phrase I wish more people understood. Money cannot buy dignity directly, but it can lower the price you pay for acting like someone who has some. When you have a runway, you ask for the raise more cleanly. You push back more calmly. You stop performing desperation. You can walk into interviews without praying for rescue. You can reject a bad offer. You can absorb a transition. You can stop lying to yourself that this is just how the world works. Many promotions, better jobs, and sharper negotiations are downstream from that one internal change. Now, most people who have never had real reserves will assume I am exaggerating. They will say, how can $10,000 change all that? It changes all that because the problem was never purely arithmetic. The problem was constant exposure. If every problem is one paycheck away from becoming a crisis, then your whole identity gets shaped around fragility. Remove some of the fragility, and suddenly the same person looks more rational, more patient, more confident, more deliberate. The person did not change, the pressure did. That is one of the deepest truths in money. Pressure is the great personality distorter, and savings is pressure relief. It is also, very importantly, identity proof. This is another part people miss. The first $10,000 is not merely a pile of dollars. It is evidence. It proves you can now behave differently than you used to save $10,000 from scratch, unless you are operating from unusually high income or unusual support. You had to learn some hard things. You had to become someone who could delay gratification repeatedly. You had to begin separating wants from wants, wearing the costume of needs. You had to notice your leaks. You had to stop using your present mood as the main architect of your finances. You had to survive the very boring stretch where progress feels slow and nobody congratulates you. That identity change is more valuable than the money itself, because the person who can build the first $10,000 can usually build the second with less confusion and the third with more momentum. This is what people mean clumsily when they say getting rich is easier after you stop being broke. What they really mean is that once you have built the habits and emotional architecture necessary to keep money, the system starts compounding more than your account balance. Your character starts compounding, your discipline starts compounding, your clarity starts compounding, your self-respect starts compounding, and that compounds into better decisions everywhere else. There is another phenomenon here that deserves more attention: decision fatigue. People like to talk about money as if every purchase is just a simple choice. It is not. For someone who is financially exposed, every purchase is part of an exhausting micro-litigation process. Name brand cereal or generic, lunch out or sandwich. Fill the tank fully or partially, replace the tires now, or stretch them a month. Accept the fee or move the bill, pay this card or that one, buy the thing now or risk it getting more expensive later. Every one of these consumes attention. None seems catastrophic alone. Together they form a permanent tax on the brain. This is part of why people who are always short on money often seem mentally tired in ways that outsiders do not appreciate. They are not just short on dollars, they are short on mental slack. The first $10,000 buys some of that slack back, and the return on mental slack is enormous. You stop solving grocery shopping like a battlefield problem. You stop interpreting a $200 surprise as a moral event. You stop feeling a minor mistake as if it were the beginning of a slide. This does not mean you become sloppy. It means you become less brittle. That is healthier, much healthier. It also leads to something else people do not expect. Once a person has reserves, he often becomes more willing to spend intelligently. That sounds backwards until you understand what is really happening. When every dollar feels like it stands between you and collapse, you become defensive in a way that often blocks wise spending too. You skip the useful conference, you skip the skill course, you skip the networking dinner, you skip the better laptop that would let you work more efficiently. You skip all the investments in yourself because the downside feels too immediate. A real savings base changes that equation. You can now ask a better question, not can I survive spending this, but what does this purchase do to the future if it works? That is a more mature question. It is how people begin turning savings into leverage instead of just security. And this is why I say $10,000 is the first serious border crossing. Before it, money is still mainly defensive. After it, money begins to become strategic. That is also why I think the common advice to celebrate yourself the moment you reach a savings milestone is dangerous when taken too literally. I understand the impulse. It is natural to feel relief, natural to feel proud, natural to want proof that all the effort meant something. But the first $10,000 should not be treated like prize money. It should be treated like the foundation of your future negotiating power. Spend it for celebration, and you buy one brief emotional high, protect it, and you buy a new operating system. That is the better trade. The emergency fund is not supposed to feel glamorous. It is supposed to feel quiet. It is supposed to sit there and reduce your desperation so that every other part of your life can begin behaving more intelligently. This is why people who save successfully often look boring from the outside and powerful from the inside. Outsiders see less nightlife, fewer impulse purchases, a more ordinary car, fewer declarations of success. What they do not see is the growing ability to resist bad deals, survive surprise costs, think about the future clearly, and move through the world without the constant humiliation of being one problem away from financial chaos. That is real luxury, much more real than anything status culture sells. In fact, the first $10,000 often changes your relationship with status itself. People with no reserves are especially vulnerable to symbolic purchases because symbols are cheap ways to medicate stress. A nicer phone, a nicer car payment, the right dinner, the right clothes, the right trip, the right image. All of these things can make a fragile person feel temporarily less fragile. But once you have real savings, some of those urges weaken. You begin to understand a deeper pleasure. The pleasure of knowing you do not need to perform stability because you actually have some. That is one of the greatest emotional upgrades money can provide. You no longer have to buy the look of control. You begin to own some control. Now, of course, I do not want to romanticize $10,000 into something. It is not $10 million dependence. It is not permanent safety. it is not enough to make terrible long-term decisions and walk away unhurt. It will not absorb a catastrophic medical event, years of unemployment, or reckless investing. It will not fix a structurally broken budget forever. It will not compensate for debt habits that continue poisoning your cash flow. But none of that reduces its significance, because the value of the first $10,000 is not that it solves everything. It is that it solves enough of the right things that your life can finally stop behaving like every month is a referendum on your survival. That is already enormous, and for many people it is the first real glimpse of what wealth is supposed to feel like. Not extravagance capacity, capacity to endure, capacity to choose, capacity to think beyond Friday, capacity to recover, capacity to say no, capacity to wait for better terms, capacity to take a small swing without risking a total fracture. That is why the number matters. Not because some guru invented a round figure, because around that point for a lot of lives, the mechanics of money stop being purely punishing and start becoming partially protective. The person with zero savings is often forced to improvise. The person with $10,000 begins to plan. That is the shift. And once a person has crossed that line, another beautiful thing happens. The future becomes believable. That matters more than people think. Human beings are much better at continuing hard processes when those processes stop feeling like blind sacrifice. The first $1,000 is mostly pain. The first few thousand are still full of doubt, but at $10,000, a person can finally say, I have built something that changes my real life. Not some future calculator fantasy, real life sleep, calm risk tolerance, confidence, dignity. Those are immediate returns. Once you see those returns, saving stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like self. Respect, that is when behavior gets easier to maintain, and when behavior gets easier to maintain, the next milestones come faster. The first $10,000 proves the machine can be built. The second proves it can grow. The third begins to make compounding more visible. From there, everything gets more interesting, but it all starts here with a 5 figure line that most people underestimate because they are too busy worshiping larger numbers. I do not make that mistake. I know what $10,000 often really is. It is the first time a person stops being financially naked in a world full of sharp edges. It is the first time the mind gets a little room back. It is the first time a problem can stay a problem instead of becoming a chain reaction. It is the first time you start to negotiate with life instead of just pleading with it. It is the first time your money begins to serve as a defender rather than merely passing through your hands like water. That is not trivial. That is the first layer of freedom. So if you are still building toward it, do not insult the goal by calling it small. It is not small. It is the first meaningful moat. And if you already have it, do not insult it by treating it like spare cash. It is not spare. It is the money that teaches your nervous system what non-desperation feels like. Guard it, build beyond it, let it do its real work. Because once you stop living one surprise away from panic, the rest of money starts making a lot more sense. And from that point on, you are no longer just someone who earns money. You are someone beginning to own your reactions to life. That is a far bigger transformation than most people notice. It is also where real wealth begins.